This is Treks to Nowhere. So, the Arctic Circle. It's somewhat of a fickle thing. You might think that you have a clear understanding of what it is and, more importantly, where it is, but you might be surprised to find out that it's actually a really complicated thing to define. Here's what I mean. So if you go online and you start reading about the Arctic and exactly what the Arctic is, if you define it as all area north of the Arctic Circle, well, what you're going to find is a very distinct list of countries that find some part of their landmass within the Arctic Circle. Now, some of these are quite obvious, right? Like Russia, Canada, the United States, because of Alaska, right? All these countries definitely have part of their landmass above the Arctic Circle. But here's where it gets interesting. If you look at that same list, you might see that Iceland is listed. Now, your first thought might be, well, obviously it's Iceland, of course. It's icy, it's north of the Arctic Circle. But I want you to go and look at a map and see where Iceland is and see where the Arctic Circle is. Because you'll see, upon first glance, that it appears, ostensibly, that the entire island and country of Iceland actually falls just south of the Arctic Circle. So then I ask you, if Iceland falls below the Arctic Circle, why is it listed as an Arctic country or a country with landmass above the Arctic Circle? And this is where it gets really fun. As it turns out, there actually is a very small part of Iceland that does fall above the Arctic Circle. If you zoom into the country of Iceland, way up on the north coast, and you try to see where the farthest point north is on the mainland of Iceland, you'll see it's about 2 to 3 kilometers short of the Arctic Circle. So true, mainland Iceland is not within the Arctic. However, if you zoom out and you look a little bit north of Iceland, you will see a small island north of the main portion of Iceland. And this island is called Grímsey. Now, Grímsey is quite small. It's only a few square kilometers in size. There's only about 60 permanent residents on the island. And while there is a very small airstrip on the island, most travel is by ferry. Now, you can pick up this ferry in the northern Icelandic town of Dalvik, and it will take you north up to the island of Grímsey. Now, if you zoom in on Grímsey and you look, you will see that a very small portion on the northern tip of the island is north of the Arctic Circle. If you were to just do a cursory search, what you'd find is that there is a marker put up on the island right near the little airstrip that marks the Arctic Circle. And so people can go to the island, walk down to the end of the airport, take a picture at the sign, and voila! Not only have you crossed into the Arctic, crossed the Arctic Circle, but you visited the 1 square kilometer of land, roughly, within Iceland that falls within the Arctic. Case closed, right? Everybody's happy. You've gone to your remote, obscure place. You've tickled that little exploration itch, and you've come away with a cool story. Not quite. And this is where my fascination with this question started. And oh boy, the rabbit holes I went down really got me geeked out. So here's the thing. The Arctic Circle is not a stationary line. Despite what you may have learned. Now, middle school or grade school, you might have learned the Arctic Circle sits at 66 degrees, 33 minutes or something like that, right? But why? Why that latitude? Think about it. Why not 70? What is it that defines the Arctic? and defines the Arctic Circle. Now, if you remember back to your earth science class or some geography class you took, you might even know more. You might know that, well, the Arctic Circle defines a very specific line that has to do with the solstice, both the winter and the summer. So in the winter solstice, it's the farthest point south of winter darkness. So if you go just south of that line, you'll get some sunlight on the winter solstice. And conversely, the summer solstice, it's the farthest south where you have all day sun in the summertime. So if you go just south of that line, you'll get a tiny little bit of darkness on the summer solstice. So you might even have known that. That's what defines both the Arctic and the Antarctic Circle. But again, I go back to the question of why 66.33? Why is that the number we all learn? And the answer has to do with the Earth's tilt. Now, the Earth does not have a perfectly vertical rotational axis. The pole of rotation of the Earth, the axis at which the Earth spins, tilts at about, you guessed it, 23.5 degrees. Well, what's 90 minus 23.5? 66.5, right? So that's where the number comes from. It's simply because of the tilt of the Earth's axis. Okay, great. You're thinking, so 66.5 degrees explains it perfectly. The tilt of the Earth's axis is 23.5 degrees. So that explains it. If the Earth had a perfectly vertical rotational axis, well, you'd have no seasons, first of all, and the Arctic Circle wouldn't exist. It would just be at the pole. So here's what I'm getting at, is that you might think that's the end of it, but it's not. So here's where it gets interesting, and actually a little bit more relevant to the kind of research I do in polar areas. So the tilt of Earth's rotational axis at 23.5 degrees changes sinusoidally. So what I mean is it gets a little steeper, goes back to a little shallower, goes back to a little steeper, and it swings back and forth. And that whole cycle from steep down to shallow, back to steep, takes 40,000 years. Now, that range of tilt is somewhere between like 21 degrees and 24 degrees. And we are at 23.5, so we're getting pretty far down on that tilt, and pretty soon, 8 to 10,000 years or so, we're gonna start swinging back up again. What does that mean for the Arctic Circle? Well, it means the Arctic Circle moves. Now, that tilt in the Earth's axis that I've been talking about does have a specific name. Scientifically, it's known as Earth's obliquity. And that change in the Earth's tilt and that 40,000 year cycle that I mentioned, that it goes through, is part of a larger series of cycles and changes in Earth's axis and orbit called the orbital cycles, or the Milankovitch cycles. And there's actually a lot of things that the Earth's orbit and Earth's rotational axes do over tens of thousands of years. So first thing is the obliquity. The axis tilts down and up, down and up. The second thing is called precession, and if you think about how a top spins, the Earth's axis is also doing that. So at the same time it's going down and up, it's also spinning around like this, very slowly over a 20,000 year cycle. So it's actually spinning and going down, spinning and going up, spinning and going down. So it's a combination of two different axes changes over 20 and 40,000 year cycles. Now, obviously, as you can imagine, this has profound impacts on the seasons, on ice ages, and this is one of the primary natural forcings of climate change. So when you look back in history at all the glacial and interglacial cycles from the last 800,000 years or whatever, in the Pleistocene, they are driven by changes in Earth's orbit or changes in these cycles. So that is a large natural forcing. However, if you're thinking, could that be what's causing modern climate change? The answer is no, because these cycles are so slow that the changes take tens of thousands of years to be realized, whereas what we're seeing today is not only happening orders of magnitude faster, but we can actually measure the CO2 concentrations and the isotopes of CO2 in the atmosphere and prove without any doubt that they're coming from the burning of fossil fuels. So that's how we know that it's anthropogenic and not natural. So moving back to the Arctic Circle. With all of this said, you can probably imagine that, well, the Arctic Circle is going to change. It's going to slowly move up and down over tens of thousands of years. And you'd be correct, but you might be thinking, but surely if it's a 40,000 year cycle, where that line is drawn on the ground, you know, it can't be moving more than a minuscule amount per year. Well, you'd be surprised. It actually turns out that the Arctic Circle is migrating about a meter a year. That's a lot. So every year you go back to Iceland, that Arctic Circle is slowly marching its way north off of Grímsey Island. And so I started thinking, I said, okay, where that marker is drawn by the airport is where the Arctic Circle was when it was erected near the turn of the 20th century, right? So it's been over 100 years, meaning that Arctic Circle has moved over 100 meters northward. So I went online and I found a calculator, a special calculator for Earth's obliquity. And if you plug in any date, past, present, future, doesn't matter, any date, it will tell you the precise location of the Arctic Circle to something like 8 decimal points, right? So like to a millimeter on the ground. So I did that. I plugged in a specific day in August of 2017, got the exact GPS coordinates, plugged it into a map and looked. And here's what surprised me. When I pulled up the map and I looked where the line was drawn, it was incredibly close to the very northern tip of Grimsey. And so it was at that moment that I realized not only has it moved almost to the tip of the island, but very soon Iceland will no longer be in the Arctic Circle, which is mind-blowing. And so, of course, I immediately got it in my head that I need to get to Grimsey and visit this tiny sliver of land at the very northern tip of an isolated Arctic island north of Iceland that can only be reached by ferry or a very expensive plane ride. Now that seems like a lot of planning and a lot of logistics. Well, as it turns out, I actually already had a planned vacation for Iceland that very same year. And so all I did was look at my planned itinerary, when I was going to be on the north side of Iceland, and add an extra day to go up and back to Grimsey and hike out to this tiny little remote square of land that's north of the Arctic Circle. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. If you go into that calculator that I was talking about, you can project into the future where the Arctic Circle line is going to be. Essentially run what's called a forward model. So you're putting in data and you're telling the algorithm project it into the future. And what it spit out was the next 100 years. Now what I did was I took all those data and I plotted them to see where the Arctic Circle would be in the next 10 years, next 20 years. And what I discovered is that by 2060, give or take a year or two, there will no longer be any landmass of Iceland within the Arctic. And what's interesting that I didn't mention before is not only does the Arctic Circle move up and down linearly because of the obliquity of Earth's tilt, but because of that precession, it actually wobbles its way down and then wobbles its way up. So it kind of goes through this cycle where it moves north a little bit, moves south a little bit, moves north a little bit, moves south a little bit, moves north, and it keeps doing that all while trending in one direction, and then it moves back the other way. So if you actually program coordinates into that calculator, you'll see that the movement of the Arctic Circle, again, is very complicated. Right now it's trending north off of the island, but every couple years it trends back south a little bit before it trends north again. And so that's why there'll be a short period of time where Iceland is not in the Arctic, but then is back in the Arctic again, and then is not in the Arctic for 9,000 years, right? So this is why it's so fascinating, is that we're right at that point in time, right now, within 40 years of that 40,000 year cycle, where the tiniest sliver of Iceland is within the Arctic. So how can you not want to visit that and be a part of that? Because by 2060, Iceland won't be in the Arctic for another 9 to 10,000 years. So now's your chance to get out there and experience it. And so at some point in the year 2061, some poor fool is going to have to log on to the Wikipedia page for Iceland and remove it from the list of Arctic countries. Now, I think that's pretty neat. All right, so now that you're sufficiently filled in on the backstory, let's get to the trek to nowhere. So, in late August of 2017, I made a trip to Iceland for vacation. Now, the purpose of this trip was to rent a small camper van and essentially drive the well-known ring road around the perimeter of the country, visiting all sorts of places along the way, with a definite focus on sort of the more remote places, given my attraction to those sorts of places, but then also to make this side trip up to Grimsey. Now, I knew it was going to be expensive for the ferry. I knew it was going to take a whole day, but I didn't care. I also knew that I'm probably not going to be back to Iceland anytime soon, so this was my one chance to do it. So before I left the United States, I figured out my itinerary for the trip, and I booked a ferry ticket out to Grimsey for day 6 of my vacation, knowing that I would be spending the first 5 days kind of circumnavigating the south and making my way up towards the northern town of Dalvik. Now, the night before my ferry ride up to Grimsey, I was camped in this tiny little campground, sitting in the back of my little camper van, cooking, and I looked up and I saw the most spectacular display of the Northern Lights I have ever seen. The kind that were bright green, moving like curtains, swaying around. It was indescribably wild and something I will never forget. So the very next morning, I got on the ferry and made the passage out of the fjord and across the open water towards Grimsey. And at the time, that was the roughest boat ride I have ever been on. And just about everyone on the ship got sick, was thrown up. It was pretty nasty. I managed to keep it in, but I definitely got pretty sick. Now, 2 years later, I ended up spending 3 months on a research expedition across the Drake Passage in the Strait of Magellan, which are the roughest waters in the world, and I got pretty used to rough waters after that. But for the time being, in Iceland, it was a new experience. By the time we pulled in and docked, I was feeling much better. As soon as I got off the ferry, I started walking. I had 5 hours to spend on the island before the ferry ride was scheduled to take me back. And so top priority was to get out to that northern tip. Any time after that was just bonus time that I could explore elsewhere. So I started hiking, and the first place I stopped, of course, was the airport marker. I mean, for posterity, it is the official marker. It's got some historical significance. So I took some fun photos there, and then immediately found the single track trail that starts going north towards the tip. The 2-kilometer hike up to the northern tip of Grimsey was spectacular. Amazing cliffside shots. The whole northern part of Grimsey is elevated several hundred feet off the ocean with these very steep cliff sides. So it's amazing, and there's puffin birds everywhere. And then what's even better is there's sheep on the island, because there are some small ranches and farms. And I just remember thinking as I was hiking north, like, that right there is the northernmost sheep in all of Iceland. Or that sheep is the only Arctic sheep in Iceland. You know, just goofy things like that that just tickle my mind. I just get such a kick out of. The hike went really quickly, took lots of pictures, and before I knew it, I crested a small hill and knew I was close. Now, I had my GPS with me with the exact locations of the Arctic Circle for exactly that day at exactly noon, which is the time I predicted that I would get there. And sure enough, it was something like 11:30 a.m. And so I pulled up to a spot and my GPS started chirping at me. And I realized I was standing one leg south of the Arctic Circle and one leg north of the Arctic Circle, cutting right through me. Now, obviously, my GPS unit is not accurate to within, inches, but still, somewhere in there, I crossed the line. And I like to think that I was straddling the Arctic perfectly. But I kept going north, and very quickly the island ended. So there was only, I don't know, something like 30 meters or something, 20, 30 meters left of the island. And then ocean and nothing. And so I sat down at the very tippity tip of the island, placed a rock on a small cairn that was there, sat on the cliff edge with my legs dangling over, and ate a snack, drank some water, took a bunch of videos and pictures, and just, again, took in the nature of the situation and the magnitude of the situation, and smiled to myself when I also realized that despite all my time in the Antarctic, all my time in Alaska, all my time in Canada, all my time in the Yukon, and all these places that are very far north, I had actually never been north of the Arctic Circle. So stepping forth onto this 20-meter parcel of land on the northern island of Grimsey marked the first time that I'd ever been to the Arctic. And that was what made the trip worth it. So if you liked this story on my trek to nowhere, to Grímsey Island, Iceland in the Arctic Circle, I will put the links down below to my full trip report of this adventure, which includes all of my photographs, a lot more of the backstory and the research into the movement of the Arctic Circle, and some video clips that I took up at that actual point so you can feel like you're actually there with me and get a sense of what it was like. Now, this will also be a featured chapter in the text that I'm putting together, so you can look forward to that as well. And if you have any questions about the trip or about the research, please feel free to ask. I'm happy to geek out about this stuff. I mean, this is my jam. I love talking about geographical oddities and strange places and obscure remote places, so hit me up. So, where have we been hiking to today? Well, it turns out all this time I've been hiking up Slate Mountain, one of the peaks in the area that have been on my list for quite some time. So you can see a beautiful view of Kendrick over there and a not so beautiful view of some rain clouds brewing overhead. So it's time to get back down, but thanks again. Take care, everyone. Be safe, and I'll see you in the next video.
Ooh, I almost forgot, because I know someone's gonna call me out on this. I am aware that there is a small rock that sticks up out of the ocean several hundred kilometers north of Iceland called Kolbeinsey, which is technically the farthest point north in Iceland and will remain in the Arctic Circle for much longer than Grimsey. However, due to extreme wave erosion, that rock is expected to be completely disintegrated and disappear under the surface well before 2060, when the Arctic Circle permanently moves above Grimsey for the next 16,000 years. So that's why I didn't include it in this video, but I do understand that it exists and that technically it is the farthest point north in Iceland. Now, if you're interested in learning more about Kolbeinsey, YouTuber Tom Scott actually chartered a helicopter flight recently to fly out to actually see if Kolbeinsey was still above the surface. And as of last year, it still is just barely poking up above the surface. But again, due to heavy wave erosion, it's expected not to last very much longer. So that's it. That's my little disclaimer. I just wanted to make sure I got that in because I know someone's going to call me out on it. All right, guys, bye.
Okay, well, I am sitting on the northern tip of Grímsey Island in Iceland, essentially the northernmost point of all of Iceland. So basically everyone else in Iceland is that way. I'm looking out into the Arctic Ocean, the Greenland Strait, up towards the North Pole. And as you can see, this is the view behind me of the island here. And the view in front of me is literally just that rock, which then drops off into the ocean. It is pretty scary, actually, right here. Yeah, so it's pretty cool. Finally made it above the Arctic Circle.